This week, Emmet calls up artist Zander Cannon to talk about his work on the 2003 Alan Moore miniseries Smax, a spin-off from Moore's series with Zander Cannon and Gene Ha, Top 10. What does the handprint on Smax's chest mean? Is all fantasy just a ripoff of J.R.R. Tolkien? And more. But first, if you're enjoying this podcast, support the show at patreon.com/deconcomics for as little as $2 a month. With your pledge of at least $4 a month, you can access hours of bonus commercial-free podcasts. And if you give at the $10 level, you can review the book of your choice with me on the podcast. Pledge your support now at patreon.com/deconcomics.
This is Emmet.
And this is Zander.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Emmet Acuna in country Victoria. Today is a very special episode for me because I'm getting to talk to the creator of a book that I feel is highly underrated and is a spin-off of another book which I think is perfectly rated because Top 10 is a lot of fun and it's one of the most entertaining comics of the last 20 years. And in fact, when I was preparing for this conversation, I was trying to see, was there maybe a handy anniversary for me to attach this to, maybe some sort of starting point. And what I arrived at was that, well, it's 20 years since the conclusion of the first season of Top 10. I apologize for dating both of us there, Zander.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. I that hadn't sort of clicked with me, but yep, that is right. Wow.
Yeah. It's and what I mean by that is there was Top 10, which was about 12 issues. And then that had spin-off Smax, which is the comic I want to discuss with you. And based around the adventures of the character Smax, who is this blue giant superhero in the city of Megalopolis in the book Top 10, which is the premise of the comic is that everyone in this city, everyone in this space, no matter what their social status is, no matter what they do for a living, they're all superhumans. They're all superheroes of one stripe or another, and they're all living on top of one another. And there's this character who looks like a giant blue man called Smax, who's invulnerable, and he's a bit grumpy. And we later learn in the dedicated miniseries that you did with Alan Moore that he's actually from a fantasy world, or as he calls a back world, which is a loving pastiche of almost every fantasy novel you've ever read. So we go from superhero as cop drama, which I think is commonly how Top 10 is described, to Smax, which is every fantasy novel ever in this little miniseries. So completely inverting what you've already read. And I'm going to get into. I'm going to get this maybe now. Actually, I was a little heartbroken when I reached out to you and you agreed to do this conversation. That it's actually extremely difficult to get Smax.
Oh yeah. Oh, believe me, I know. I mean, people are always telling me like, "Oh, I've heard of this, but it's sold out everywhere. It's out of print," and that's those the market forces, I guess. I don't know.
Okay. Well, it went from it. Okay, so we can get into all of this, but like I am interested in the ABC line, how the ABC line happened, how you arrived at Top 10 in the first place. But my understanding is this was a book published by America's Best Comics, ABC, which is sort of a line of comics, all sort of masterminded by Alan Moore with the different collaborations and bringing these stories together. DC then acquires Wildstorm, which owned ABC. So then it becomes a DC book. Now I understand it's a Vertigo book. So
yeah. Mm-hmm. We've some of the reprints.
Yeah. So now it's a Vertigo.
And that makes but now Vertigo's gone. I mean, Vertigo doesn't exist as an imprint. So everything's just a DC thing, which I think is too. I mean, I thought Wildstorm was a useful sort of like a useful sort of like signifier that this is sort of separate. I mean, I always kind of thought like if they were smart, or if they were specifically thinking about this, they would kind of separate things into kind of age related tiers. Like DC was sort of for all ages ish, Wildstorm for sort of teens and up, and then Vertigo more mature readers. Like, but of course that doesn't, there's other forces at work, so that didn't really make any sense to them. But yeah, I think it's too bad that it kind of exists in this sphere, and I don't think that DC would find Top 10 or Smax or 49ers or anything to be perfectly valuable, or to be valuable in particular if they couldn't sort of absorb it into the DC universe like they did with Watchmen, and so it doesn't. I mean, and it at its best, written by the most famous comic book writer of the late 20th century, it sold fine. It sold okay, and Smax sold less than fine. It was. I don't think that there's anything about this that they really wanted to that really makes them come back to it, other than like some fondness. I'll hear about some fondness from some editor, but that only goes so far.
Yes, and I think what I might attempt to do with this conversation is launch the campaign to revolution Smax. I get comics back out there again, because it is just extremely enjoyable and a lot of fun, and a little curious and a little weird and strange and all these things at once. And isn't that the point, that we should be celebrating original works that actually poke the bear a bit in terms of our expectations of what this is? I mean, when I started on Top 10 and Smax, when I was in my late 20s, and I remember that was a really big moment for me when I sort of saw that, like, here's a serious, and I'm making air quotes, a serious book, that had stakes and everything, but had made no bones about the fact that it was absolutely absurd. Like that there was just absurd jokes on every single page, and like, oh, these superheroes who live in the city do drugs or whatever. Like, there's all this sort of like everything's a send up, but it has stakes and it has a serious arc for characters. And I just thought, like, that was something that, I don't know, it was the closest that sort of got into the mainstream, because I feel like a lot of times there's everything, like even the silliest superhero stuff now, I mean, and I'm not saying now, like, as opposed to like when it was good, but like I'm saying that what you usually see is like, this is a joke book, this is a funny book, or this is a serious book that may have gags in it, but it takes its premise seriously. And I felt like these, for some reason, they didn't take their premise very seriously, but they nevertheless told a substantial story, which I thought that was eye-opening to me. One of my favorite jokes in Top 10 is there's an issue set in a God's bar. So it's a bar where gods go to drink and hang out. And at one point we visit the toilets, and there's toilet graffiti, and there's like Frost Giants rule okay and stuff like that. And I love that. The little side gags, little things, and
so much of that is Gene Ha. I mean, right. I mean, certainly, probably the most prominent ones Alan wrote because he puts a lot of detail into his scripts. But Gene, I mean, Gene and I have share the same sort of like thing where it's like, oh, we're doing something about Norse mythology. Let's look up as much stuff as we can and like try to fit it all in. And I mean, he put in so much detail. He really deserves so much more of the share of credit than I think that he gets for that series. I think he gets plenty of credit, of course, but I mean, what he added to it was something that no other artist could have added.
I was reading an academic paper from, I think she's a Danish comics author, no, comics academic rather, sorry. And she's now, I say author because she's now also writing for a Danish comics website. But she did this analysis of the first issue of Top 10, and she talked about Robin getting into the cab with the blind cab driver who's a Zen cab driver. Folks listening, if you haven't read Top 10, look, I'm scraping the surface of how weird and wacky this series is. But she's in this cab with a blind cab driver who's just trying to get to his destination. And she described how the paneling moved around the page to give the reader the impression of being in a car crash or spinning out of control. My understanding is that you were breaking down the script into all these page layouts, and then Gene was then adding the detail and bringing it out. Is that correct?
For 90%, 99% of the series, it was. But the funny thing is, Gene did that. Gene did all that on his own because I started maybe 3 pages after that.
Right. Oh, I see. Okay.
So yeah. So I mean,
that opening is Gene.
Yeah. The opening is Gene. He really. I mean. So he was doing layouts. I think he had a different assistant than, like, because I was initially going to come on as his assistant, but I was more experienced than an assistant would be. So that was how it ended up working up that way. But like, so I think that somebody was working with him that was doing backgrounds, which, I couldn't do backgrounds the way that Gene does backgrounds. So I said, we have to work out something different. But anyway, Gene was doing all the sort of storytelling and blocking out at that point in the thing, and I think that it wore him out too. Like it was too exhausting to then have to do that much more detail. And so when I came on, I sort of could block out things, figure out where word balloons are going to go, and sort of do all the basic storytelling so that he could go, oh, that background of can have these gags in it, and free him up to do a little bit more of the stuff that you come to Gene Hoff for, the details and the sort of the beauty of it. So,
well, next time you speak to him, you can tell him that a Danish academic was inspired by him to apply the theories of Mikhail Bakhtin to that opening 3 pages.
Wow, that's great. Well, I'm sure he'd be delighted to hear that. Well, maybe he will. We'll post this to Twitter, and I'm sure he'll see it.
Very good. I want to get to Smax because, as I said, I think this is the underrated top 10 spin-off, and I'm sure we'll circle back to top 10 a couple of times during this conversation. One of the ideas about Smax I love is the person we know to be Jeff Smax, who eventually we learn is named Jaffs Maxon, I believe.
Yeah.
So he's traveled from a fantasy world to the real world of top 10. He's traveled to what we would consider the real world in this dynamic of a portal fantasy, from a fantasy world. And that reverses the port world dynamic of Narnia, where people go from the real world to the fantasy world. He's coming from the fantasy world to the real world.
Yeah.
I love that. And I love this recurring idea throughout the series of these fantasy characters like the dwarves mimicking life in an urban setting, and office politics, and like their version of Dungeons and Dragons is people working in dead end jobs in an office,
right? Or wasn't there one called Malls and Muggers? I thought.
Yes,
I thought. Yeah, I thought that was it. Great. I mean, that's Alan Moore to a T. Just with the sort of precision, of sort of like, here's a gag, let's reverse it, let's apply it to this, to this world. And I mean, there's always a dozen things going on that are, just the way, like you were saying in top 10, where it's like we see the Norse mythology, but it's never just sort of like the Norse mythology that you picked up from Thor comics. It's oh no, somebody who actually knows something about Norse mythology. Fantasy too is like, Alan Moore's no slouch when it comes to writing fantasy. It's not like he's just going to be like, oh yes, there's Harry Potter and Narnia or whatever.
We'll get to that. Yeah,
we'll get to that. Right. And so he I think that I really appreciated that there was an intense sort of love-hate relationship with fantasy that could get kind of played, that could get sort of like worked out in the pages of this book.
And one of the best jokes of the series is, for Smax, this is normal life. This is just his ordinary life. So
he's fed up with it. I love it.
Yeah, he's sick of it. Like, and that's why he's so he kept talking about and he mentioned in top 10 that he came from a back world, and there was this sense of embarrassment just coming off him in waves for his past. Whereas now we learn over the course of this miniseries that not only is he embarrassed by it because he's from this place and it's too familiar to him, it's also very tragic as well. Like, what's happened to him is deeply traumatizing. And he I think it's almost a sense of loathing he has for the place. He never wants to go back there.
Yeah. Well, and in such a tough guy way that he just is like, I'm going to forget about everything that happened there, and just start anew. And I think that there's a lot to be said there. And it's funny that it's with a sort of a knight-esque character, a dragon slayer-esque character, that usually when you have them in a story, they're kind of ciphers. They're just they're a little flat. They're the thing that they do is slay dragons. They don't like worry about stuff or be sad or whatever. And so I think that was kind of nice, especially since the way he played in top 10 was pretty flat. I mean, in an entertaining way, gruff, and sort of not very forthcoming. But that was it's fun to sort of parse out who that character is over the course of a couple issues.
Yeah, we even learned he had what looked, again, because we assumed when we first met the character that he was a superhero, just a giant blue man who's invulnerable. Right. And he has a handprint in his chest. Again, I'm not spoiling this for anybody who hasn't read Smax yet, but turns out there's a reason for the handprint on his chest. It's a very sad story behind that. And it's actually, as a moment in a comic book, I remember being left breathless by that. I remember just this moment of, my God, that was devastating.
All right.
So, hat off to you and as well.
Oh, thanks.
Just the heartbreak in that panel of the reveal of where the handprint came from. It's a beautiful moment. It's very sad.
Well,
it's a beautiful moment.
It's funny too. I mean, of course, I never knew the way that Alan Moore works is like, he didn't really discuss any of this with us. I mean, I think that if we'd asked, he would say, "Oh, this is what I'm thinking." But I mean, I think that a lot of that stuff gets decided on the day that it's written. And so, I didn't know where that handprint came from. And so I've been drawing it really big. And so, I mean, it's funny, that you're like, well, I mean, he's sorted this out pretty well in his head. So, I'm just following along. Like, that was really, it's kind of a funny way to work. But
it's a great moment as well, because it flips your understanding of what you've seen, because he looked just like he had a typical superhero logo, like the Batman logo or the Superman S. It's just something on his chest. It's almost like a piece of branding on his chest.
Yeah.
And we learned that's not what it is at all. So your understanding of what he is, not simply him coming from a fantasy world, but like his entire look shifts. You understand?
Well, and I think too, like that the whole thing is kind of circular because Gene designed that character, and I didn't have anything to do with designing the character because he was designed before I came on. And I think that Gene just kind of said, "Oh, his name is Jeff Smax. Well, he's a big blue guy. Let's have something on his chest, like a superhero emblem or whatever." And thought of that, to have it be kind of a little bit different, a little bit sort of grittier than sort of like a clean Art Deco-esque, design. And so, but then, but that's the sort of the brilliance of Alan Moore too, is that he sees that and goes, well, now what can we do with that? Let's let the art inform the writing now. And I think that, that's a great way to work. And I think that's the brilliance of it, because these stories, he makes them seem very tight, but they're pretty loose. They seem very tightly plotted, but they're pretty loose. They kind of inform each other. And it's like, what's going to be a good scene? What's going to work itself out? I think that's it's thinking on your feet, so to speak. And I really sort of have come to appreciate that even more than I did at the time.
Yeah, it's sounding more and more collaborative the more you describe how this evolved. Yeah. Which, again, it goes back to that debate of the authorial voice. I think this sounds like it's a free floating exchange of ideas almost,
Yeah. But in a very sort of like, ordered way.
Yes,
like
sure.
It's not. It's more like, I did this, you did that. I'm going to take that and I'm going to add it to my next round of script, and then then you can interpret it the way you like. And I think that's really it's fun to play with it that way. I mean, sometimes it doesn't feel as collaborative as when you go, all right, let's sit down and hash it out.
Sure.
But I think it sometimes can work better.
I had meant to mention this before. Actually, I'll say something else. You, at the time of recording, we're now into, is it the final Kaiju Max storyline? Final Kaiju Max series, if you like?
Yep, I've just finished the first issue. The first issue's out.
Just at the time of recording,
so five issues left of the 36 issue run. So
congratulations.
Thank you. It's really I never thought I'd say that.
Because the reason it springs to mind for me in this moment is because of what I just described, the scene I just described of Smax. Because Kaiju Max makes me feel so sad. Like, I feel so sad, but I always feel
mission accomplished.
I always feel amazed that there's a delicateness, if you like, to that. And the comparison I make is to The Walking Dead, which I remember at a certain point, I think it was around the storyline, there was a storyline involving a child murderer. I remember just feeling, okay, I'm miserable. I'm miserable, and I don't want to read this anymore. And Kaiju Max, I finish each issue and I go, I'm sad. I have to read the next one.
Okay, good. Well,
there's this propulsive, there's this sense of, oh no, this is meaningful. This is making me feel things. And the comparison I would make with your work is to the work of, say, Taika Waititi, where one moment I'll be laughing and the next minute I'll be crying,
right. Which is always the hope, especially when you do both at the same time.
Yes. Yes. And so I can see the seeds of that in Smax as well, because I think the Smax miniseries has that too. It has these moments of laugh out loud comedy, like gut-busting humor, and then just devastating sadness.
Yeah, and I think I don't know how Alan feels about it when in terms of like the goal, but I think that sometimes it's like the sadness isn't so much the goal as as making it consequential, that there's something that matters, that it isn't just sort of like, oh, and then Gulliver got, just the winds blew him away to the next land, that there's something that questions are posed and answered, and that it feels like it means something. And I mean, and I think that, you don't expect that to see that in something that's kind of a joke. Smax, Top 10, and Kaiju Max are all kind of joke premises, almost like a SNL sketch, it's a bit. Sort of, it's a bit. It's like, oh, haha. I mean, you could do a 3-minute sketch on Kaiju Max or Smax or whatever, and it would work. But like, I think that's the fun part of comics, is that like, it don't cost anything to make to speak of. So like it's kind of fun to really explore that world and go like, oh yeah, like this turtle monster is a tragic hero, or this giant blue dragon slayer guy is as sad as anything. That's something weird going on with his sister.
Yeah. No, look, that's unavoidable in any conversation. If you Google or if you search for Smax on Twitter, you'll come across Sean T. Collins. I think at one point he made some comment about it's a lot of incest in this comic. And you go, okay, thanks for that comment, Sean.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
I thought it was a Philip Jose Farmer reference. I don't know if that was like, what kind of fantasy novels or topics were you guys discussing when it came to creating this world?
I mean,
what were the touchstones?
I mean, I wanted to do. I mean, when we were talking about it, and we only talked about it some. I thought, it would be fun to sort of like have more shades of Robert E. Howard than Tolkien. Like something that was a little grittier and sort of rougher hewn than sort of like elf stuff, or whatever. I mean, I love Tolkien, but like, something that was a little bit rougher around the edges, and and he liked that, and he liked sort of what a tragic / absurd figure that Robert E. Howard was as well, and like, I think that we, and of course, we're a different generation, he and I mean, so I wanted to sort of like incorporate a lot of 80s stuff and like, and weird fantasy stuff that was more from funnier material as well. Yeah. And and I mean, some of that happens, some of it makes it in, a lot of it makes it into the art, without necessarily infecting the story, or changing the story much. I put those trolls with the weird hair, that you put on top of the pencil, like
spotted them,
put those in, or and so and I think I was probably trying to bring in some I think that my influence one way or the other was usually to keep things from being quite so fantasy, like kind of basic fantasy, like if there's a dragon, the dragon was just kind of designed like, this is a frightening dragon with a bunch of eyes, I believe. And I said, but it was sitting cat-like. And so I ended up maybe making it more cat-like in design, I gave it this fringe around its face that was actually a fractal image. It wasn't literally a fractal image, but it was based on a fractal image that's called the dragon. And so that it had this sort of fringe around the mouth. And I just wanted to make things not look like dragons. And the dragon sort of like apparatus that Robin uses towards the end was based on sort of like Chinese dragons. And then the ogre that was Smax's father, I wanted to make look different from your usual ogre. I didn't want to make it look like Mr. Hyde from League of Extraordinary Gentlemen or anything. I just and I think people gave me a grief about it too, because they're like, well, really? that ogre looks too cute, right. And it's like, I don't know. I mean, yeah, whatever. And I mean, and I probably wasn't really aware of how grim a story, or I was maybe not sort of like reading the room in terms of how grim the story was, but like, but I don't know. I mean, I wanted to sort of like, have this design influence that was a little bit less standard or conventional.
Coming up, is all fantasy ripped off of Lord of the Rings? Has Harry Potter become too controversial to read? Well, Smax has some weird stuff in it too. Unlock classic early episodes of Deconstructing Comics. Help me return all the old episodes to the podcast feed and get access to hours of additional podcasts about MCU movies and the early Amazing Spider-Man issues by Lee and Ditko. Support this podcast and our other shows at patreon.com/deconcomics. Or you can send a one-time donation via PayPal to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support.
You like cheap comic books, right? Well, I'm Professor Allen, and I talk about cheap comic books on the Quarterbin Podcast. In every episode, I'll dissect a single comic from my collection, as long as I paid no more than 25 cents for the issue. Forget about $4 new comics that you can read in 4 minutes, or crossover events that can cost $100 to collect. Join me in the Quarterbin, where even bad comics are a bargain, and good ones are a steal. The Quarterbin Podcast is part of the Relatively Geeky Podcast Network. Visit us at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com or search Relatively Geeky or Quarterbin Podcast in iTunes. I guarantee it'll be worth every penny.
You mentioned, because you previously had been on Deconstructing Comics, episode 395, Zander Cannon's Journey Through Heck, if you want to Google that, folks. You talked to Tim. But you mentioned that you were in Japan while you were working on Smax, I believe.
Yes, right. Yeah.
And I've also seen you throw in mentions that you were looking to introduce Miyazaki sort of style or creature features to this too. And Morning Bright has a touch of that. Am I off the mark there?
I think that sounds right, because I was probably, sort of absorbing a lot of Miyazaki stuff. I mean, we went to the Ghibli Museum when we were there, and there's probably a bit of Totoro in there somewhere.
That's what I was thinking.
Or whatever the things from Spirited Away came out at that time, and so there's probably a little bit of that in there. Yeah.
The Totoro isn't Totoro the fan theory is that he's a spirit of death or something. He's like a death god or something like that. Well, Morning Bright.
People can't enjoy anything, can they? They just it's like, oh, this is a nice thing. Let's make it awful.
yeah. Actually, this is a deeply dramatic film. If you think about it, I don't want to. Morning Bright is the dragon you've described there, and I mentioned to you in my email or my message to you before that this character has just been stuck in my head ever since I read it. And you've said, Alan Moore described it as a thing with lots of eyes. But the look of Morning Bright, the sort of the sense of it almost being like a primordial god. You infest the environment with Morning Bright at one point. He's all over the walls. He's
right.
And he can change shape. He speaks through time to Robin through an acrostic, which I think is a beautiful moment as well. Again, there are moments in this comic which just, I remember reading the physical comics and just being stopped by them, going, "Oh my God, what is this?" So yeah, just in terms of all of that, I'm talking over much here. The look and feel of Morning Bright that you brought across the line, it's an astounding creation. I think it's incredible. Yeah.
Thank you. I hadn't seen it in a while, but somebody asked me to draw it recently, and so of course I haven't done it yet, but like I looked up the picture. I just kind of looked it up online, and I was like, oh yeah, all right, that's interesting, because it's kind of different from how how it is in my head. So
right.
But yeah, I think I was really always kind of surprised at what they let me get away with. Because when I think about it, it's like, man, he really kind of described him as like a regular dragon, a Smog-like dragon, right. that is big and imperious in its bearing, and like but it was brightly colored, or like a gold and stuff like that, and white. But yeah, it is funny to think like, yeah, wow, I got away with drawing a dragon that really doesn't look like a dragon at all. But yeah, I do think I do think that would have, making it look like a standard dragon would have kind of made that series seem a little bit less unique. Like it would have kind of made it feel like, oh, okay, I know what the story's about. And it's like, I don't know, maybe you don't, like it's because it's so much more grim than you're gonna guess.
This is it, because when you encounter this character in the comic, it immediately flips your expectations. It's my experience. Like, I mean, you're like going, oh, I don't know what the story is anymore. What is this thing? What can
I mean? Right. And I mean, what the story is in that, like, oh, they're in a cave, there's something dangerous, but like, yeah, like there's I hope that helps you sort of have a sense that it's different, like, you don't want to get sucked into like a way that you think that the story is going to go.
Yeah. And even what the point of Smax's return to this world, and then Smax's eventual conflict with Morning Bright is all leading to, again, it flips your expectations. It's not a straightforward hero quest. It's quite involved. So congratulations again. I did mention, was there any particular fantasy fiction touchstones? And you threw in a couple of mentions of things from the 80s. I wanted to pick this up with you again. Sorry. Was the Reaper Dennis? Was the Reaper a reference to Terry Pratchett's death by any chance?
No. I mean, I have read a few Terry Pratchett books, but not really. Like, and I hadn't at the time, I don't think. And so I really was like, I mean, for one thing, like it wasn't a very tactical move for me to have Death have like a bunch of skulls and a bunch of hands.
Yeah.
Like that's like what's the hardest thing to draw? Skeletons, and then it's like more stuff, more skeleton stuff. It's a terrible idea, but I liked the idea that there would be sort of like a bloom of skulls. Just that would be something that would be, again, it's like that it would be something that you hadn't seen before. And that you wouldn't just go, oh yeah, it's just another Grim Reaper guy. And Alan, I don't recall that he said that he had more than one skull. I don't recall, but anyway, I don't think he did. I think that was my idea, and so I just wanted to make it be something that wasn't quite so. Yeah, again, that was kind of a new design. That was something you'd seen before, but taken in a different direction. So
it's almost like a metal album cover, like just Robin, like that moment of Robin meeting Dennis.
I'm sure that was in there. I'm sure that's why I was thinking of that, like Iron Maiden cover or something.
Yeah. No, I can see that's a poster. Yep. I can see that. Yeah. And like there's a lot of parody here as well. I mean, you mentioned before Tolkien, and this is inevitable, I guess, but like my impression of the fantasy genre, and this is when I say this, I'm talking about the period from, say, the 1950s, 1960s to the 1980s, because recently I think fantasy has diversified a lot, which is great to see.
Yeah, sure.
But there were a lot of Tolkien alikes, if you follow me. And I even had the experience of, I went to see Terry Brooks at an event in Melbourne, and he's the author of the Shannara series of novels from the late 70s onwards. I think they still make them today. And somebody had the bravery to ask him, but aren't you just ripping off Tolkien? And I think he gets this. I think he gets this all the time. And there was like a visible sort of shaking vibration off him. But it has to be said that a lot of the fantasy genre of that ilk, of that sort of fantasy type, is a pastiche of Tolkien, or following in line with Tolkien. There's elves and dwarves and honorable men, and they go on a quest. And that's what I enjoyed so much about the broad church of Smax. It's not just the sword and sorcery stuff. It's not just the Frank Frazetta cover you have with the sort of Smax the Barbarian. The incredible,
super fun. I love that cover.
Amazing cover. But you have all these other stuff. Like there's a goblin that appears on one panel, and it's the Green Goblin. It's the Green Goblin as a goblin.
Hilarious, right? It's just it's classic stuff.
it's a great little beat. And you've got appearances from different fantasy characters. You've got, I think, Cerberus pops up in one bit. You've got the Sean Connery. There's a reference to the Sean Connery movie where he voiced the dragon. There's all sorts of little nods to these things, and that's what I enjoyed so much about it, was the sense of fantasy is much more than the Tolkien model, if you like.
Yeah. And I think that was my goal in trying to keep it from being too Tolkien-esque, is that because that's the gravity well that everything kind of like leans toward, is that once you're in Tolkien land, you can't get out of it.
That's it.
And I think, I think that it's a little, I mean, people obviously were writing a little bit like Tolkien because that was selling and stuff. But I also think, well, all Tolkien did was take a bunch of stuff from folklore and kind of stick it together, and and it all kind of made sense. So people were like, yeah, all right, yeah, sure, that's how it works. Just the way that the Marvel comics just took a bunch of like pulp heroes and kind of sort of put them, or DC Comics kind of took all these pulp heroes and just kind of stuck them in this world, and people were like, oh yeah, all right, that makes sense. And so now that's our sort of model for a world in which there are superheroes, and of course Top 10 took to a ridiculous extreme.
And I've been talking to Tim from Decent Comics about Spider-Man a lot recently. The 1963 Spider-Man. We're doing a little sort of mini podcast about it. And one thing I liked about the Green Goblin was I think originally Stan Lee had intended for him to be an actual goblin or an actual mystical character, and is Ditko who was like, no, it's a dude in a mask. Let's stick with the real world.
But then Ditko, I heard, wanted to have him be somebody who had never met Peter Parker, and it was just like a random dude,
some dude. Yes.
And then he's like, no, he has to be this character that we never thought was the Goblin, but.
So you get this impression of Ditko like really leaning into, no, it's the real. It has to be the real. It's a real. Yeah. It's a person. It's just a random person. He doesn't matter. He's not important. Stanley's trying to warp and weave this sort of mythical.
Right. Well, you can see Stanley's like instincts as a storyteller. You gotta have it be like, what a shock, a surprise, and and Ditko. I mean, and you can tell from all of Ditko's stuff that he did on his own, it's like, oh yeah, well, he didn't really have that sort of like humanist like let's tie up every story with a bow type of thing. It was just like, I'm going to illustrate these philosophical points. So
yeah, no, it was a nice little nod. And we mentioned before, but there's an Alan Moore essay, I think it's called Fossil Angels, and he mentions J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter and you can see he doesn't come at it directly. He sort of comes around a bit. He sort of comes at it from the angle of this is magic as commercial property. This is magic as mass-produced product. That's how he seems to be reflecting on the whole Potter mania. He's seeing he's seeing merchandise. He's seeing spin-off materials. He's seeing multimedia product, movies and games, and that's what he's, as opposed to magic as practice or magic as individual art or magic. That's his argument in Fossil Angels. It's like, where is magic? What's the state of magic today? It's Harry Potter, which is you're going to the supermarket to get your Harry Potter product, or is it you're trying to have that that idea, that Rambo idea of derangement of the senses? That's magic. It's this notion of like, how do I express the world in this weird way? Which brings us to Smax, because Harry Potter here again is just the butt of a joke. And I was curious, do you think it reads different today? Because I think there was a bit of defensiveness around more digging at Harry Potter in this, and in, I think, Century, he has a go at Harry Potter as well, with the Harry Potter as Antichrist.
Okay.
Yeah.
I remember thinking it was a little funny that it was like, he seemed to be offended by the idea of Harry Potter. Yes. And I remember thinking like, okay, it's a huge property. Even then, it can take the licks or whatever. Pretty much, I did think it was funny that it was like that he was so offended of it. Of course, he's a man ahead of his time. But yeah, like I just remember thinking like, oh, okay, sure, we can make fun of, we're making fun of everything else, we might as well make fun of Harry Potter as well. But I did think the way that he went about it seemed like, oh, he had a personal axe to grind about it.
yeah And it's funny because like, it's interesting to watch how this has fallen out with the fan base of this particular book now suddenly deciding they're trying to divorce the author from the books because they love the books so much, but they don't want anything to do with Rowling. But now more and more problematic stuff is emerging from readings of the books. And they're going, oh, wait, this was always here. This is already at work here. So
and stuff that people noticed. I think that people noticed sort of problematic or sort of odd stuff all along, but it was just like, well, those are sort of the price of admission for popular sort of fiction. And I think that it's nice that we just say, we don't have to accept that anymore. you know, like we don't have to accept the one Asian character being named Cho Chang. I mean, that's absurd, you know? And so it's nice that we can that we can be aware of all that stuff. And I also just think, you know, you can go back and read those books. I mean, you know, I just read a ton of Lovecraft for a sort of a Cthulhu like pastiche in Kaiju Max. And it's like, oh, it's horrendous. You know, it's horrendous. I mean, and some of it's badly written, but some of it has this unbelievable sense of like, time and place and like this sort of cosmic dread, et cetera, et cetera. But, and even as we know, like, oh yeah, H.P. Lovecraft was a reprehensible person. But I don't know. I do think a lot of it is just like, yeah, you can read that old stuff. You don't have to incorporate it into your being. You know, you don't have to. You can read a Harry Potter book and not say, "Oh, I love Harry Potter. I am Harry Potter."
Yeah,
it was, and it was fine in this way, and it was obnoxious in this way, and whatever.
Yeah, that's it. It's the identity of being a Harry Potter fan. That's what's interesting about this. And I think for any of you folks out there listening who maybe feel disabused, Smax is fun. You should check that out. It has Harry Potter in it.
Yeah, right. Well, move on to. I mean, and Smax has weird stuff in it too. Like, yeah. I mean, I think that the incest stuff is pretty weird. Like,
so we should attack this directly. It's Smax's sister Rexa. Their mother was a hero who was captured and raped by an ogre, and they were the offspring of this horrific encounter. And the ogre then kept them as his. He liked having them, I guess. Yeah, right. They were his
pets or whatever.
Yeah. And they kill him. Christ, this is probably a spoiler, but never mind. But the fact is, they were in this horrible situation, and the only comfort they had was one another. And then that is shown to be incestuous. And it's not quite flowers in the attic, but like it's. Yeah. So that's in there. Yeah. And I always thought as sort of a joke at the idea of the backworldy. Because he keeps saying backworldy, and he meant, I think Smax jokes about inbred cousins or something at one point as well. So like, there's something happening. He's aware of it. And he's embarrassed by it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lot of. I mean, anything that you're going to make especially if you're trying to have something be a little bit, edgy or. Transgressive or something like that. It in a period of time, the next, 20 years now that we see that it's 20 years later, it's like, yeah, that's not going to come across the same way that you wanted it to. It might be better, might be worse. I mean, but it's not going to come across in the same way. And I think that qualifies when you read stuff that's 20 years old. You kind of go like, okay, what was the situation in which they were, that they were telling the story? Like they were probably reacting to something that had just come out, or a type of, or a theme that had just been happening. And I mean, I don't know, that I feel like I look back at it and I'm like, I mean, I didn't write it, so it's a different way of feeling about it. But I mean, it's, I don't know. I think that you have to read that, let that stuff go a little bit and move on to the next thing, and maybe say, I don't know if I do it this way again, but I'll stand by it in the meantime.
Yeah. No, that's fair. You mentioned before we started recording as well that this was one of the last times we had some hand lettering at work here, like Todd Klein's work on this.
Yeah, I don't know if it was the last, but but certainly
the dying of the art form.
Yeah, I mean, I was like, please hand letter it. I really wanted to have hand lettering on the originals, and Todd Klein is a gentleman, of course, and so he said, sure, no problem. And I think it was probably was a problem, but yeah, so that was really, and that's always really fun to be able to ink around the word balloons, because I think, try as you might, if you have computer lettering that's put onto artwork that doesn't sort of incorporate it, you always end up with tangents. If you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I'm following.
And so like you're always going to end up with someone's head that's just barely grazing a balloon, and I think that I always think that that's a little bit too bad. So I wanted to make sure that he lettered it on the pages, and I was more of a stickler about it then than I would be now, mainly because I letter my own stuff typically, and I letter digitally but by hand in the file,
okay,
which is just as absurd. It's just as absurd. So but anyway, yeah.
No, I think that's interesting because a lot of folks talk about lettering as we need to champion the letterer more. I've done some small comics work myself, and lettering makes all the difference in the world. Like I've really come to appreciate it. Just
you can make a great looking book be terrible with bad lettering, and you can make an okay comic look great. You know, like I felt like Tom Warzakowski on all the X books in the 80s. I mean, I feel like all those books had great artists, but like there was a uniformity, and there was like it really elevated all the work because it was so precise and so organized. Lettering I think is, it's hardly sort of forgotten, but I think it's underappreciated for what it really does.
Yes, I think that, and that's the point that I think we keep landing on, that we need to be celebrating it more. Just as we should be celebrating this book. It's also equally underappreciated. Sir, I just want to say thank you for your time. I don't want to cut us off, but like, is there anything you'd like to throw in before we finish up?
Well, top 10 and Smax. I was so lucky to have the opportunity to work on them, because Alan Moore was choosing people who were at the top of their game, and so that was Gene Ha, that was Chris Sprouse, and and J.H. Williams. People who were truly masters, and I got lucky. I got lucky because Gene Ha was a friend of mine, and so I and Alan was so welcoming and so thoughtful, and I felt like he really sort of listened to my ideas insofar as that it helped the story, and like, and it was an entire art school in that couple of years, the art school and story school, that sort of like template for that sort of ultra precise sort of mashup, cops and superheroes, or fantasy and backworld sort of portal fiction. That really reshaped the way that I wrote, and it's influenced everything that I've done ever since. So.
Yeah, and again, folks listening, let's get this campaign rolling. Let's get Smax out published again, but also read Kaiju Max. It is like I can see your lineage, almost your creative lineage from Kaiju Max back to this. I can see where you took from this and then you arrived there. It's a great book as well. So I'm really happy to.
It's a straight line.
Yeah,
from top 10 to Kaiju Max, absolutely.
So happy to see you wrap this up, and also credit where credit's due. The reason we're talking at all is because you had an appearance on the podcast, The Flophouse, which is one of my favorite podcasts. I really enjoy listening to it.
Mine too.
It's great fun, and if anyone is listening to this and you're not familiar with The Flophouse, it's a bad movie podcast, but also the folks on the show, Dan and Stuart and Elliot, they will drop some deep comic book knowledge just randomly. They will, there is a lot. If you like comics, if you're interested in comics, listen to The Flophouse. There's some stuff in there they'll just like throw randomly into a conversation. I go, ooh, you read that too. Yeah.
Right. Like you think that, they're just going to do like a basic, X-Men reference. And it's like, no, this is like serious,
deep stuff.
Deep stuff. Yeah, that's great.
And they had you on as your capacity as a kaiju expert because of Kaiju Max, which I thought was great to review.
I think was so funny.
Godzilla versus Kong.
The idea of being an expert is absurd. But I love it. I mean, I'll take it. No matter, like, they were like, you want to come on to talk about Godzilla and Kong? It's like, yeah, I already watched it. Like, let's do this.
I still haven't seen it. I'm hanging it to watch it, actually, because it looks like a bit of fun. But I haven't seen it yet.
Sure, it's great. I mean, when they were like, is this a good bad movie or a bad movie or a movie are you kind of like it? I'm like, of course I kind of like it. What are you kidding me? stuff got smashed, didn't it? Like, I'm there.
On that note, thank you so much, sir. Where do you want people to find you if they need to track you down or contact you or see what you're doing?
Well, Twitter is always a good spot. Zander_Cannon. And, you can check out kaijumax.com, which is my sort of Tumblr page. It's infrequently, updated. And I have a Patreon if you want to check that out. But yeah, that'll be it.
Twitter, Patreon, and kaijumax.com. Thank you so much, sir. Pleasure talking to you, and I'm looking forward to... Oh, before I forget, I tracked down, because I have Smax obviously back in Ireland, my original issues, which are probably worth some ungodly amount of money now, but I tracked down a copy. I've been on eBay. I'm seeing what they're going for. I tracked down a library copy in Australia, and it's been shipped out to me. So I will get to read Smax again in the next week. I was hoping I get to read before I spoke to you again, but like just this sense of, wait, it's not available digitally. It's not available in my local. What? This is crazy. So I'll get to read it again. Shortly.
Wow, digitally too. Huh? That's pretty crazy.
That's just breaks my heart. Anyway, on that note, thank you, sir.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Smax was published by America's Best Comics. It's out of print and it's not on Comixology. eBay is probably your best bet if you want to get a hold of it. #ReprintSmax. You can help Deconstructing Comics and all our podcasts by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. And go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, to shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and we'll critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. The next episode of Critiquing Comics will be out this Saturday. A double-header next week on Deconstructing Comics. I talk with Derek and Emily Ritter, whose company Sequential Potential helps academics turn their perhaps dry, boring essays into engaging comics that have a story. Then Adam joins me to talk about the latest book from Sean Michael Wilson, The Minamata Story, an eco-tragedy, with art by Akiko Shimojima, about the 1950s mass mercury poisoning by industrial waste here in Japan. Not an easy subject, but an important one to remember. All that is next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.